The only race that is worth winning is the race precisely to be carbon neutral. And if at the end of the day we bring the rest of the world with us, that's probably the best thing we can provide as Europeans for climate action globally.
Mr. Kanfen, thanks for your time. You lead the Environment Committee in the European Parliament, and climate change is on the top of our agenda. The Parliament in the past year has passed several legislations to cut emissions, to help people transition into a green energy, to reduce fossil fuels dependency. Our fellow citizens are also worried about the protection of nature, which is a main element in the fight against climate change at the end. Yeah. One of the main problems that we have in our days is plastic waste. Can we do more to reduce plastic waste? The European Union has already come a long way since banning single-use plastics, but people would like to see more and even to help more on that.
And people are right, and that's exactly what we are doing. Last term, we banned some very iconic single-use plastics, like straws, for instance. By the way, we still have plastic straws in a lot of places in Europe, so it means that this regulation has been set, voted, but it's not always implemented. So that's the first element. But then still we need obviously to go beyond this. And that's exactly what we are doing. Another negotiation which is ongoing, the Green Deal as a whole, it's 75 legislative proposals. So we are negotiating a lot of them right now. One of them is precisely dealing with packaging. So paper packaging and plastic packaging. And the goal is to massively reduce single-use plastic packaging, sometimes even banning it for specific products, and making sure that it is more recyclable and more recycled. Because it's not only because it's recyclable that it is de facto recycled. So we need to work on all the value chain. Less plastic at the beginning.
In the supermarkets?
In the supermarkets, everyday life, to package things we buy. When plastic is still needed, making sure that it is recyclable, and then making sure it is really recycled to make, again, a circular loop to get back to a new plastic, but without having to use more oil, because we all know that plastics means oil. So that's the purpose of this regulation, and I can tell you that it is a fierce battle against some lobbying groups that are trying to do whatever they can to kill this text, and it is unacceptable.
And the solution for reducing this plastic wrappings on products would be to replace it by paper, because that could be also a problem.
Exactly. So you have one option, which is the best one, which is to reduce the quantity of packaging. So moving from a over packaging, for instance, when you receive a parcel from Amazon, for instance, you have sometimes a small object you bought, and then around it you have plastics, and then you have a parcel, and then you have again something else, and then you have a parcel. Well, come on, you are buying things and you'll receive a parcel this way. So one of the proposals that is now negotiating is precisely to set a limit in the quantity of packaging you can use for a specific object. But sometimes obviously we need packaging. You cannot just get rid of packaging for obvious reasons, including sanitary reasons. When it is needed and when we can't do something else, then we need to switch as much as we can from plastic to paper, but making sure that this paper is really recycled and not made of paper plus plastic. It's a big discussion. Some groups are trying to convince us that the definition of paper should include plastic. That's the kind of lobbying we are facing. When you take a bag, sometimes within the bag, it's paper, but then there is 10% of plastic. And then it cannot be recycled because it's way too costly to separate again plastic.
We see that a lot,
And that's crazy. There are producers in Europe doing it without plastic. We shouldn't be afraid of moving from a cup with plastic to a cup without plastic. Let's take this responsibility.
Your proposal does it also foresee something to not increase the deforestation? Because if we're using more paper, we need to tear more forests down.
That's why the first element is limiting packaging to get there, we need to promote reuse. Years ago, when you went to a restaurant, you didn't have this plus paper thing. You just have a traditional glass element, for instance. That was then kept in the restaurant or in the shop and then reused. And it means much, much less waste. So let's promote this.
But it means more work for the restaurants and more energy and water consumption.
No, much less water and much less energy compared to using a cup that usually comes from China, by the way. So made half the world traveling, then you use it once, 10 seconds to drink a coffee, and then you put it in the bin. It's much more energy consuming than just washing it. So we need to reorganize some sort of common sense that we lost. And I must say that France is one of the very few countries having already that kind of law. And it works. If you go to a McDonald's in France, or a KFC, or whatever fast food you want to get, you will have not things that will be thrown just minutes after, but that can be reused. If it works in certain McDonald's, why it shouldn't be working in all McDonald's in Europe?
A big chunk of European waste ends up in other countries, in non-EU countries, because we export that. Yeah. How can we make sure that this waste that is exported to poor countries is well managed and doesn't just transpose a European problem to poor parts of the world?
So I fully share your analysis and your concern. What kind of waste do we export? It's sometimes in very poor conditions in terms of management that have a direct impact on kids elsewhere in Europe, for instance. The position of the parliament is very clear. We need to ban this. We need to ban exports of waste in countries that are not equipped to treat this waste. Otherwise, it is just full hypocrisy from our side to say, okay, I'm not going to pay to treat this waste. I just exporting to Ghana. It's a very unfortunate case, well known to Ghana. And then it's just polluting Ghana coast and polluting health of citizens in Ghana. And how come we can accept this? And we hope that we will be able to convince member states to have a clear ban on things that are not treated elsewhere. On the contrary, of course, if we export things in Canada or in Japan or in the US where they have the same technologies that we do, well, no problem. And we should also stop looking at waste just as a waste. It's a potential resource if we want to create a circular economy. So we need to use this resource precisely to create things that do not require mining activities or more oil or more gas.
And I wanted to talk more about deforestation. European Union has been for years accused of contributing to deforestation in other parts of the world by importing products that are issued from forest areas. This year, Parliament has passed a new law that will force companies to take responsibility and to avoid that whatever they sell here comes from these areas. What is the impact that you expect from this new legislation?
So it's a massive piece of the Green Deal. It's the very first global law regulating exactly what we call imported deforestation. That
it's been praised by NGOs as something historical.
Exactly. As Europeans, we are the second in the world after the Chinese in terms of contribution to the deforestation of Amazonia, for instance. Why? Because we import a lot of goods coming from Amazonia. Soybean, for instance, palm oil when it comes to Indonesia, for other kind of forest. We want to stop this because it's the opposite of what we want to get, being more green. So we said, okay, if you cannot demonstrate that your soybean or your palm oil or your cacao or your coffee is not contributing to deforestation, then you cannot enter the European market anymore. Because we want to guarantee to the European consumer, to the people watching this video, that when they have a coffee or when they have a cocoa, it's not contributing, even without her or him knowing this, to the deforestation of the tropical forest of this world.
And what's the impact that you think this will have in global deforestation?
Well, it will be massive because, as I said, we are the second contributors. So if we manage to change, that will definitely reduce the pressure on this forest. And of course, now we are working with Brazil, with Indonesia, with Malaysia, with Argentina, and so on, precisely to make that work on the ground, and when needed, putting additional development money from the EU to help farmers on the ground to switch from practices that contribute to deforestation to practices that do not contribute to deforestation. So it's a legal framework, but it's also something that we work with farmers on the ground to make sure that it is implemented.
Well, when the European Union tries to help halting deforestation or protecting nature in other parts of the world, some actions can be seen as protectionism, or it can be accused of being interference on national affairs and national sovereignty, like we see with the environmental clause that the European Union is trying to push on the deal with Mercosur.
It's a very important question, of course. First, is it protectionism? The clear answer is no. Why? Because we are setting the same rules for ourselves. Protectionism is when you set rules for imports, but you do not set the same rules for yourself. That's protectionism, and that it is unfair competition for the others. But it's not what we're doing. With this deforestation law, we have exactly the same regulation against deforestation in Europe and outside for our import. Another example is what we call the carbon border adjustment mechanism, where we say, okay, if you produce steel or aluminium in Europe, you pay a certain level of carbon price, but if you import the very same ton of steel or aluminium from China or India, you pay, when you enter the European market, you pay the exact same price. So it's not protectionism, it's just level playing field. But then we need to make sure to avoid the second criticism, which is, let's say, call it green colonialism. Okay, that actually it's a new colonialism against developing countries. Well, the fact is that climate is a global issue, and we are the largest market in the world. It's not something that is well known by Europeans. In terms of economic value, the European market is the first one in the world, beyond the US and beyond China. So let's use this power for the goods that we import, not for the rest of the world. I mean, if there is a transaction between China and Brazil, nothing we can do. But for the goods that we import, we take a responsibility to make sure that they are greener and greener and greener. And to be honest, it is exactly what the European citizens expect from us. And if we can have a positive impact outside our borders, to my view, it's a good thing.
Other than deforestation, some European companies have also been accused in the past of financing or even leading projects that caused major environmental damage and even life losses in other parts of the world. I'm thinking about landslides from minefields in Brazil or the flooding of some indigenous territory in Guatemala. What can the European Union do to help preventing this from happening?
It's very important, of course, that we take care of this issue. So one of the laws that we are negotiating under the umbrella of the Green Deal precisely try to address the issue you are referring to. It's called due diligence, meaning that if you are a European company and you operate outside, like in Guatemala, you need to make sure that you follow very strict criteria not to have frauds, not to have corruption, not to have social scandal or environmental pollution. Of course, we always need to strike the right balance between this objective and the fact that if the constraints are just way too high, then it is impossible for them to operate in a context that is just different from the EU. I mean, Guatemala is definitely not Sweden or Denmark. Okay, so we need to take care of these values because it's the heart of the European values, like fighting against pollution or fighting against child labor and so on. That's key. But if we go too far, then we probably put our European companies outside the market and then we lose jobs. So that's the right balance we need to strike.
Do you think European Union is doing enough to protect our nature?
Well, we are doing multiple things. I will start with the fact that we are negotiating now the first ever law to restore nature in Europe. You know, so far what we have been doing is to protect nature in some spaces, so natural parks, Natura 2000 zones and so on. But now we want to go further because nature is still disappearing. So in order to go further, we need to move from protection to restoration. So restoring ecosystems that have been degraded, meaning that there is no life anymore, there is no water anymore, and to bring nature back again on this ecosystem. That's a very first example. A second one is the fight against pesticides. The main driver that is de facto killing nature today in Europe is the use of pesticides. And by the way, it's logical because it is made for this. We need to decrease the use of pesticides in Europe based on the first law that will harmonize systems to reduce pesticides in Europe. Today we have only 3 countries that have a legal framework to reduce pesticides in Europe. With this European law, we will move from 3 to 27. So it's a massive change.
A group of young people from Portugal just recently took 32 European governments to court over climate inaction. They come from an area in Portugal that was ravaged by forest fires and extreme heat, and they argue that the failure of these governments of taking a stronger action against the climate change is what led to this situation and caused them mental distress and health risks. What do you think of this course of action?
So first, there will be more and more legal actions of that kind.
You think so?
Because it will come from citizens against states and also against companies. And there is no reasons for citizens, starting with the young generation, not to go to court and to ask for justice. They are right. And that's why we are doing much more now than what we did 5 years ago. That's
so it's
why
good that they're doing that.
We are doing the Green Deal. If there was no problem, including in terms of justice, including in terms of human rights and capacity for this new generation to live on a healthy planet, why should we bother?
So that's a good pressure.
Of course it's a good pressure. It's a good pressure on us as Europeans and member states and the European institutions, and a good pressure on companies as well to act more, because we always need to act more and more. We know that we are not there yet. When you look at what we have done so far, it's massive. We mentioned the carbon tax on board. We didn't even mention cars being now zero emissions 100% by 2035. But we mentioned some of what we are doing on pesticides, on plastics, on deforestation. Yeah. There's so much that has been done. But still, we need to go even further than that. That's why, for instance, we are now working with the European Commission on the next phase of the Green Deal for the next term after the European elections next year.
And to conclude this interview, the COP28 is about to start the UN conference for the climate change. Yeah. What's at stake this year, and what's the results the Parliament would like to see coming from this conference?
So I would love to tell you that I expect a success in COP28.
You're not optimistic?
I'm not optimistic. Why? First, because it takes place in a Gulf country where there are so much dependence on oil that they are very reluctant really to be serious with climate action. Second, we are in a world where the fight between China and the US, as we speak, is preventing us from finding real good compromises on climate, because when China says something, the US says the opposite, and when the US says something, China says the opposite. So as Europeans in that context, we try to be the honest broker, I would say, to find a compromise, but I'm not very optimistic, to be honest. And at the end of the day, now the core of what we have to do, and that's what we have been doing with the Green Deal, is to deliver, not just to negotiate additional things and taking years and years to negotiate a small piece.
So it's time to put in practice what is being done, right?
Deliver. So new rules for industry, new rules for energy, new rules for cars, new rules for trucks, new rules for trains, and so on, so that we deliver what is the key element of the Green Deal, a Europe that is carbon neutral at the latest in 2050.
But you still need to get the rest of the world on board.
Yes, and that's why the US have the exact same objective. China has the same objective. The point is that we are not going to negotiate the way we are going to get there, because it's not something that is possible to negotiate. We do not have to negotiate the amount of renewable energies that is coming out in China. We do not have to negotiate the way the US will make green hydrogen. Just do it. The good news is that with IRA, this what we call Inflation Reduction Act, the Biden plan to invest massively in the US are now on board. For the first time, they are investing for real in green technologies. just not marginal things, but massive, which is good. Then we compete, because the only race that is worth winning is the race precisely to be carbon neutral. And if at the end of the day we bring the rest of the world with us, because we are the largest markets, because we have a global footprint on deforestation, then that's probably the best thing we can provide as Europeans for climate action globally.
Thank you.
Thank you.
From the European Parliament in Brussels, I'm Marcia Bizzotto, and this is Paskal Kanfen, Chair of Environment Committee in the Parliament.